Welcome everybody. Welcome back to the 30th Annual Westheimer Peace Symposium. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of Wilmington College and the Westheimer Committee. This year's symposium focuses on peace and the nature of war through a special two-day symposium entitled The Nuclear Threat, Past, Present, Future, in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, by the United States. This year's symposium is a special collaboration with the Wilmington College Peace Resource Center, which holds an extensive collection of archival materials related to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the human experience of nuclear war. It is also held in collaboration with the Response Project funded by an Ohio Arts Council grant, which was conceived of by pianist and music faculty at Wilmington College, Brianna Matsky. For the Response Project, 7 artists across the United States have created original compositions for the symposium in response to archival materials from the Peace Resource Center archives. For a full schedule of today's and tomorrow's lectures and performances, please go to wilmington.edu/Westheimer. We are currently live on Facebook and everything is going well, but we did have technical difficulties on the side of Facebook that were outside of our control yesterday. Should we encounter any technical difficulties later on in our program today, we will post a Zoom link where you can join us directly via Zoom. And all you need to do is click on that link. We'll post it in the Peace Resource Center Facebook page. My name is Tanya Moss, and I'm your host for this afternoon's I'm your host for this morning's lecture entitled Truman's Kyoto Misconception, The Hidden Meaning of Hiroshima. In my role as host, I'm here to welcome you, briefly introduce the workshop presenters, and be on hand to help field questions and comments when needed. A warm welcome to our presenter today, Alex Wellerstein. Dr. Wellerstein is a science historian who specializes in the history of nuclear weapons. He received his BA in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD from Harvard in 2010. While he is highly accomplished across his field as a consultant and assistant professor, one of his most notable achievements is his development of the nuke map. Wellerstein is looking forward to publishing his book on the history of nuclear secrecy in early 2021. He sits on the advisory boards for the Atomic Heritage Foundation and ALSO's Digital Library for Nuclear Issues. Alex, we welcome you, and I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tanya. I'm pleased to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen. You're going to see my picture of my dog for a moment, and then I'm going to get the keynote on that screen. And let's see if that works. All right, you should be able to see my my screen right now. All right. Hello, welcome. I'm really pleased to be here, really pleased to be talking with you. This talk comes out of research I've been doing for about the last 4 or 5 years at this point, and an article that I had published earlier this year on this. So if you want to learn more, you can. I can tell you how to do that. I want to start this talk off with a very provocative assertion, and one that I do not expect you to believe while I say it right now, and it is this. In the run-up to the bombing of Hiroshima, President Harry Truman thought that he had made a decision not to use an atomic bomb against a city. Now, when I say it like that, and when I say that specific thing, most people their reaction is along the lines of, what? Like, how can this be, right? And it's a very strange assertion, and in the absence of evidence, again, I don't expect you to believe it. The reason it feels so strange is that all of our narratives about the bombing of Hiroshima, whether those that say it was done to shorten the war or whether those that say it was unnecessary, they all tend to agree that there's sort of a decision, a very conscious attempt by somebody, usually Truman, to sort of make some sort of bargain, right? They're making this like calculus about the lives of a city's worth of people versus some other greater goal, whether it's end the war, whether it's scare the Soviets, whichever of those narratives you go with. And most of them put Truman at the very center of that decision. What I'm going to tell you in this talk is to present a different story. It's going to be a sequence of events and issues, a framing of historical facts and attention to specific details that you may not have heard before that have led me to this conclusion. And to be sure, this was a conclusion that I came to somewhat reluctantly and somewhat surprisingly. This wasn't something I was searching for. It's more that something an explanation that started to make more sense to me in resolving certain sort of historical paradoxes that I will elaborate on here. And again, if you're interested in the more detailed version with lots of footnotes and lots of archival references and a million, scholarly bits, I can direct you to my longer paper on the subject, which provides all of that. So for the spirit of this talk, I'm going to try to be relatively concise and preserve the spirit of the paper, but not go into every little detailed case of it. You probably think that you know the story of Harry Truman and the use of the atomic bombs. For most Americans, their version of this narrative goes like this. Truman weighs the decision to use the bombs very carefully, balancing out the pros and cons, ultimately, with a very heavy heart, deciding that sacrificing Japanese civilian lives was a worthwhile means to the end of shortening the war, which would ultimately save lots of American lives and Japanese lives. And in that version of the story, usually you then say, ultimately, he was right. The counter narrative to this is that the bombs were dropped for other reasons, like scaring the Soviet Union, but it still puts Truman firmly in the driver's seat. All of the stories that are very common to Americans and thinking about the atomic bomb, they involve sort of this deliberate decision to use the bomb. Historians have known for several decades that this is the wrong way to think about this. Truman himself as a person was largely peripheral to the atomic bomb planning. He was not directly involved. He did not make the decision to use the bomb. He didn't make any distinct decision about whether it should be used or not. He basically was told of decisions that were already made by other people, by committees. You can see the use of the bomb as a sort of long train of littler decisions made by other people that by the time it reaches Truman, he sort of takes it for granted that they're going to use it and is at best sort of an accomplice to the whole thing as opposed to sort of a driving force. There were questions, however, about what you would actually do with the bomb. Most of these were, again, made by these other committees. And Truman's role in almost all of these decisions was to not deviate from what had already been decided by other people. There's one decision, though, that he actually took part in directly, one that's usually overlooked, and that is the decision at the heart of this paper, which is the non-bombing of Kyoto. And you might wonder, how do you get from the non-bombing of Kyoto to my broader question about, my broader assertion that Truman didn't really understand what was going on with Hiroshima, but we'll get to that. Sorry, my keynote is on the wrong thing. Go to the next slide. Keynote. There we go. Whoop, sorry. If we were going to look for candidates for individual people who made the decisions that really mattered, there's lots of committees and smaller decisions made along the way, but if you were going to pick sort of two actual drivers behind the bombing, probably the two most important people in the government, American government, who played a role in the outcomes at Hiroshima and Nagasaki are General Leslie Groves on the left and Secretary of War Henry Stimson on the right. Groves was the head of the Manhattan Project. He was the one who sort of kept everything running so that the bombs would be created. But in that role, he was not simply just making a new weapon. He was also deeply involved in operational decisions. He was involved in making sure that it would be deployed and how it would be deployed. He was the one, as we'll see, who drafted the strike order. He was extremely hands-on with every aspect of the project and saw it as basically his project. He, of course, believed, and to some degree, honestly, that he was doing this at the behest of the President of the United States, first Roosevelt and then Truman, but he really ran it like it was his own fiefdom. He really sort of ran with the authority. Stimson, on the other hand, Stimson is the Secretary of War. That's the equivalent of the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of War position in the 1940s was not the same as the Secretary of Defense position today. We live in a post-McNamara world where the Secretary of Defense is a very hands-on person who is actually involved with all sorts of operational, tactical sorts of decisions. For Stimson, most of his job is at most sort of broad strategy. Do you have a D-Day? Do you have an invasion of Japanese home islands? And even that's in conjunction with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other sort of high-level military officers. But more day-to-day, it's more about logistics. It's about getting the money and the material and the people and that sort of government end of things. It's not a military position. It's much more of a civilian position. Stimson himself was a sort of very long-standing civil servant. He had been the Secretary of State. He had now been the Secretary of War for most of Roosevelt's presidency. He had worked for several presidents, bipartisan. He was considered an old man in Washington. He was in his 70s. That's what counted for an old man in those days. And he had done all sorts of stuff. He was a fairly worldly guy. He had been the Governor General of the Philippines under Herbert Hoover and had seen Asia and Japan, which this will become relevant in a bit. And he was the sort of highest ranking civilian member of the government who was directly involved with the heavy decisions about the atomic bombings. He had been involved with sort of overseeing the Manhattan Project now for 3 years, and he had convened many of these committees that were making these decisions, notably one called the Interim Committee, which was in charge of basically making all of the decisions about what would be done with the bomb at the end of the war, and then also what would be done in the post-war up until some sort of more permanent system put in place. And they were the ones, for example, who concluded and made the sort of final policy judgment that the bomb would be used against an urban area, a city, without any kind of warning. And they did this in May 1945. One of these other committees that I just want to talk about a little bit because it's important to sort of contextualizing this was the Target Committee. This was a committee, and this is the cover of their second meeting, which was their most important meeting. And you can sort of see who's in the room at these meetings. And I always like to emphasize this. So you can see you got generals, colonels, captains, you got all these military people. Then you have some scientists, Dr. Tolman, Dr. Oppenheimer, of course, head of the scientific head of the project, Dr. von Neumann, Dr. Wilson, you have a British scientist, Dr. Penny. And then they also had some other sort of people sitting in on this meeting who were giving advice. The goal of the Target Committee was not to make sort of low-level policy or high-level policy, excuse me. The goal of the Target Committee was to actually figure out how you're going to use the bombs. So this is more where these decisions are being made, these kind of smaller committees that are intensely secret, very small groups. Truman's nowhere near any of these things, doesn't probably even know that many of these things are going on. The Target Committee is the one who actually comes up with the list of cities in the end. And this is their list in May 1945, their initial list. Status of targets, Dr. Stearns presented the work on target selection. Their qualifications are that these are important targets in a large urban area, read a city, of more than 3 miles diameter. They would be capable of being damaged effectively by a blast, specifically from the type of explosion they expected the atomic bomb to do. They are unlikely to be attacked by next August. The Army Air Forces at this point were systematically firebombing Japanese cities, and so they were trying to pick targets that weren't going to be firebombed ahead of time. But they wanted fresh targets, more or less. They wanted, as they say later in this document, they want it to be sufficiently spectacular. And so they had a list of 5 targets, which the Air Forces would be willing to reserve for our use. So they're actually making sure that these cities are not going to be bombed prior to being atomic bombed. And the targets are Kyoto, urban industrial area, population of 1 million, former capital of Japan. They get a really interesting sentence here that I always just love pointing out. From the psychological point of view, there's an advantage that Kyoto is an intellectual center for Japan, and the people there are more apt to appreciate the significance of such a weapon as the atomic bomb. Hiroshima, important army depot, port of embarkation, industrial area, good radar target, adjacent hills that would produce a focusing effect, not a good incendiary target, so they wouldn't probably like to firebomb it because of all of its rivers. So 1 and 2, Kyoto, Hiroshima. Then you have Yokohama, then you have Kokura, then you have Niigata. We don't really need to focus on them as much for this talk. This is their top list of targets in May 1945. If you were, so again, Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, Kokura, Niigata. You'll notice, as everybody usually does, that one, Nagasaki isn't on this list. We'll talk about Nagasaki and how it gets on the list. It's related to what I'm about to tell you. 2, this list doesn't really look like the final list in some ways, aside from the fact that Kyoto is on it. We'll come back to that. You have cities like Yokohama. Yokohama gets firebombed very shortly after this. And I don't know whether that is what takes it off the list or if they had already planned this and thus were not willing to change it, but the list changes a little bit for that reason. Yokohama gets off very early on. It's interesting that Kyoto is the number 1 on the list. This is something that I think people overlook. Many people have heard that Kyoto was a possibility for an atomic bombing and that it was deliberately avoided for atomic bombing. We'll talk about the details of that in just a moment. But I just want to emphasize that it was not just on the list, it was the top of the list. This was the Army's preferred nuclear target, not Hiroshima. Here's what Groves said at the sometime later, some years later about this, quote, "I particularly wanted Kyoto as a target because it was large enough an area for us to gain complete knowledge of the effects of an atomic bomb. Hiroshima was not nearly so satisfactory in this respect. I also felt quite strongly, as had all the members of the target committee, that Kyoto was one of the most important military targets in Japan." So for Groves and for the scientists on this committee, Kyoto, 1, does have military significance. They identified several aircraft plants and other sorts of facilities in there that are producing useful things for the Japanese. And the fact that it's large, that it's a much bigger city physically and population-wise than Hiroshima, that's really going to show you what the bomb will do. And that can sound really cold-blooded, especially the way Groves labels it, to gain complete knowledge of the effects of an atomic bomb. It makes it sound like the science experiment. There's a little bit of that going on in this, though. If you were wanted to be more charitable, which I'm not claiming you need to be, the scientists in particular, they believe that all of the effect of this bomb is a psychological one. And that the best way to have whatever psychological effect you're going to have is by doing the sort of most unambiguously impressive destruction. And so having a larger target that you could maybe really destroy, that to them would look like a better outcome. And we can sort of recoil in horror from that, and that's fine, but it's important to sort of understand what they're trying to accomplish with this, at least the scientists and some of the military people. So this is their initial target list: Kyoto, Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata. But Groves didn't have the last word on this, and neither did the target committee. A little later in the month, Stimson had a meeting with Groves. And Stimson directly asked him, he basically said to him, "I heard you've come up with a target list." And Groves says, "I have." And Stimson says, "I'd like to see it." And Groves says, "I don't think I have to show it to you." And this is a very surprising sort of interaction for us today, because again, the Secretary of Defense and a general, we have a clearer chain of command for these sorts of things in many ways. The idea that a general would tell the Secretary of Defense they're not going to tell you where they're going to use a target, that would be very unusual. But you have to remember at this point, there's this pretty firm division between who's doing these sort of operational tactical choices, where are the planes actually being sent and how many men and things like that, and the sort of larger strategic questions, which are, are you going to use an atomic bomb at all? Are you going to invade Japan? Are you going to have a D-Day? This sort of thing. And in Groves's mind, it's very clear that he thought of this as being a military matter. The question of where you drop the bomb is a tactical question, and that is not a strategic policy civilian sort of question. Stimson says, "You're going to tell me." And he says, basically, I have the last word on this. He, in Groves's recollection, says that he is the kingpin on this particular subject of how the bombs are going to be used. And Groves then gives him the list. And Stimson immediately says, "I don't want Kyoto bombed." He rejects the list. And Groves tries to sort of convince him that this is the target that the scientists and the military thought was the best. And Stimson basically says, you're not going to do this. And he gives Groves a reason. It's not a totally compelling reason to Groves. And I'm not sure it's actually Stimson's personal reason, which is that Kyoto is the cultural center of Japan and the former capital of the country. And he had, quote, a great many other reasons why he didn't want it to be bombed. Why does Stimson care about Kyoto? We could go into more detail on this in the Q&A if people are interested, but it's not clear. He gives a lot of different reasons to different people. There's a story, which is pretty hard to verify, that he spent his honeymoon in Kyoto with his wife. This is back when in the 1920s. He definitely had visited Kyoto several times, but he'd visited lots of cities in Japan. I mean, why is Kyoto special? And I don't want to say Kyoto isn't special. I've been to Kyoto. It's very beautiful. One of the reasons it's special today is because it wasn't bombed during World War II. And so it's one of the few cities you can go to in Japan and see an immense amount of pre-war architecture, because it never was set on fire. And I don't want to dispute that Kyoto is a beautiful cultural treasure. It clearly is to the Japanese and to the world today. But for a guy who's overseeing the firebombing of Japan, who supports the use of the atomic bombs in general to destroy other cities, which also have glorious pre-war architecture until you destroy it, which also have cultural significance to the Japanese, it never feels quite sufficient enough that that's the reason. The best answer I've seen, or at least the one that appeals to me personally, is that for Stimson, this is sort of standing in for, Stimson is never totally comfortable with the destruction of the cities of Japan. I do think he sees it as a means to an end. He does try to rein back the army a bit in its firebombing and totally fails at this. Again, that is considered a tactical decision. And I think for Stimson, saving this one city has some sort of moral and emotional importance. You can save this one city, you can't save them all, but you can preserve at least one, and that's worth something. For whatever reason, though, Stimson is really, really eager to save Kyoto. Just to give you a sense of, again, how somebody like Groves saw this at the time, this is what Groves would later write. Stimson never interfered with a military matter that I know of, except in the case of Kyoto. And it's this idea of interference. This is the sort of military perception of what Stimson is doing. And it's not clear that Groves actually believed that Stimson had the final word on this. Groves went back many times as they were finalizing the decisions about what to do with the bomb. And by this point, Stimson had gone to the Potsdam Conference in Germany, and he's getting sort of hints from his people in Washington. All of your local military advisors, this is to Stimson, engage in preparation, definitely favor your pet city, that's Kyoto. Would like to feel free to use it as first choice if those on the ride, the atomic bombing mission, selected out of 4 possible spots in light of local conditions. Stimson immediately replies back, aware of no factors to change my decision. On the contrary, new factors here tend to confirm it. It's not clear what he's talking about, but he's trying to push back. This isn't the first time or the last time that they try to put Kyoto back on the list after Stimson had taken it off. A few days after this, he cables back where he wants the full list, and he wants name of place or alternate places, always excluding the particular place against which I had decided, Kyoto. And then he says, my decision has been confirmed by the highest authority. We'll come back to how he does this, what he gets when he means by he talks about the highest authority. I just want to make one other point about Kyoto. Stimson, basically his argument against bombing Kyoto, it varies, but it's along the lines of Kyoto is a civilian sort of target. It's a cultural heritage target. It does not have, he says, significant war industries. It is not a major military target. If you bomb it, you'll be creating this sort of resentment amongst the Japanese that you'll never be able to live down. And in this assertion, he was directly in opposition to what actually the military analysts had said. They believed that this was a great military target, entirely valid. Even after the war, Stimson would write about his role in saving Kyoto, and he would get these sort of angry letters basically from military analysts who said this isn't true. They actually had all these factories there. They actually did. Kyoto was where a lot of industrial facilities were relocating as other cities got destroyed. They would insist that this is a totally valid target. And it's worth just asking what we think about, what is the distinction between a city like Kyoto and a city like Hiroshima? I think if your criteria is the wartime criteria, which is to say, does it have a lot of military plants in it and people working on the military effort, it isn't that different. Hiroshima has a military base in it, but it's still a city. It's a city with a military base. 90% of the casualties at Hiroshima are civilian. So at some level, I want to just point out that this is a slightly artificial distinction. And this is one of the reasons I think the military doesn't accept it. They go very far in the planning for Kyoto, further than I think they actually did for Hiroshima, definitely more than Nagasaki. This is from the Manhattan Project files. This is a map of Kyoto in which they have indicated an aiming point for something like an atomic bomb and then sketched out the dimensions for which it would likely be destroyed. I've never seen them do this with any other target, to actually go in there and take a look at really what they thought would be destroyed by the whole thing. I only bring this up to emphasize that for Stimson, Stimson saying no is Stimson asserting that he has more authority over the military on this kind of tactical decision. And that's exactly what's up for grabs. That question of who really has that authority is actually unclear unless you bring in a higher authority, which is what Stimson does. As an aside, where is that firing point? That's the roundhouse in Kyoto. That's basically where the trains would turn around. The main Kyoto train station is just to the east of that there. I've been to Kyoto and that train station. And that roundhouse today is a train museum. It's still there. And to my knowledge, there is no indication anywhere there that this was the intended primary site for the atomic bomb to be aimed at, had not there been this intervention. To get that authority, to make sure that Kyoto wouldn't get bombed, Stimson went to Truman directly several times. And he did this at great difficulty. I mean, he was not actually invited. Stimson was not meant to be at the Potsdam conference. And he just showed up anyway, because that's the kind of person Stimson is. He just kind of, you try to exclude him, he'll find a way to be there. He is an old time government employee. He knows how power works, right? And he basically goes to Truman several times saying that Kyoto shouldn't be bombed and basically trying to enlist Truman into this. Because if he can get Truman to agree that Kyoto is not a valid target and that Hiroshima is an okay target by comparison, then he will be able to use that as leverage with Groves and resolve this question definitively, saving Kyoto, which is his priority here. And so we have some records about what Stimson said to Truman to do this. Stimson kept a diary, very helpful. Thank you, Stimson. On July 24th, he records having a few words with Truman about the S-1 program, that's the atomic bomb program. And I gave him my reasons for eliminating one of the proposed targets. He again gave him these reasons. He again reiterated with utmost emphasis, Truman is agreeing, his concurring belief on the subject, and he was particularly emphatic in agreeing with my suggestion that if elimination was not done, if Kyoto was not saved, the bitterness that would be caused by such a wanton act might make it impossible during a long post-war period to reconcile the Japanese to us in that area rather than the Russians. And so this is one of the times in which, this is the sort of final time that Stimson talked to Truman about Kyoto. He had previously emphasized the morality of targeting civilians. He actually claimed that if the Americans kept rampantly targeting civilians, they would, quote, get a reputation of outdoing Hitler in atrocities, which is a pretty intensive thing to warn. And also sort of these Cold War power politics. You want the Japanese on our side in the post-war and the Cold War, since those Soviets are out there, things like this. Again, I'm not sure any of these are actually Stimson's personal beliefs. These are the different lines of argumentation he's using to try and get Stimson to come along to his side. Get Truman to come along to his side. So what does Truman think of all this? Well, Truman kept a journal at Potsdam also, which is unusual. He normally did not keep a diary or journal, but he kept one at Potsdam, in part, I believe, because he was going to be tasked when he got back with giving a speech on what had happened at Potsdam. And I think he's keeping notes because some of the stuff that he writes down in these journals end up in the speech. Here's his journal entry from July 25th. I've told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it, the atomic bomb, so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are targets and not women and children. Even if the Japs are savages, ruthless, merciless, and fanatic, we as the leader of the world for the common welfare cannot drop that terrible bomb on the old capital or the new. He and I are in accord. The target will be a purely military one, and we will issue a warning statement asking the Japs to surrender and save lives. I'm sure they will not do that, but we have given them the chance. We can really compare this to Stimson's description. In Stimson's mind, it's this sort of cold, Truman agrees with me, and this is rationale, and this is going to be able to really help us, with the Japanese and their public affairs. In this one, this says really different language. Truman seems to have written down that he does not think that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target, not women and children. Cannot drop the terrible bomb on the old capital anew. The target will be a purely military one. I want to highlight that purely there because it's a pretty strong modifier, and we're going to see it again. But this is a very odd thing to read. Does Truman really believe the atomic bomb is not going to be used to kill women and children? Does he not believe that the target, Hiroshima, as a city? And historians have seen this before, and usually they conclude one of two things. One is that Truman is lying to his diary to preserve some sort of historical record. I'm not sure what the goal of that would be, since Truman never, it's not like he pulls this out later and says, I didn't understand. That never occurs. I don't think it would occur. I don't really buy that. I don't think he's lying to posterity. Also, this diary is basically lost for 40 years. So it's not like this was something that was pulled out immediately. Is he lying to himself? That's the other possibility. Can he not actually believe it? And that's possible, right? We certainly know that people can lie to themselves. The conclusion I came to is that this actually reflects what he believes, which is a sort of radical conclusion, even though it's in some ways the most straightforward. This diary entry reflects how Truman came away from that conversation with Stimson, which is to say, devastatingly confused. Truman thinks that Stimson has offered him one option, which is Kyoto, the civilian target, Hiroshima, the military target. And I think that is probably how Stimson framed it. But I don't think that Stimson intended to imply that Hiroshima was not also a city. They're both cities with varying degrees of military facilities within them. I think Truman may have come away with a misunderstanding. I think he may have thought that, as he wrote here, Hiroshima was a purely military target, AKA a military base, not a military base in a city. That's a big distinction. We're going to come back to that in a minute and what that might mean to be this wrong on this particular issue. But this is at the core of the sort of argument I'm making. Truman misunderstands this conversation, doesn't follow up on it, doesn't find out if he was wrong. And you might ask, is it possible that a president could be so confused about something so important? And, the funny thing is, when I started talking about this with people 5 years ago, people generally would sometimes ask that. Like, I can't believe that an American president would ever know so little about something of such importance. But strangely, over the last 4 years, people have started to accept that as a possibility for some reason. Who knows why? I think it's definitely a possibility, especially when you get into what Truman is doing at Potsdam. He's got so many other things on his mind. This is his first time doing real foreign policy. He's meeting with Stalin on a regular basis. He's trying to figure out what to do about Eastern Europe, post-war Japan, the Soviet Union. Is it possible that he, in the middle of all of this confusion, could have missed a few things? He himself would later tell people that he wasn't 100% in control of what was going on and was sort of felt lucky that things were working out as well as they did. And also I would point out Truman's understanding of the bomb project was not very deep. He was, he's the last president we had to not go to college. His understanding of matters of science and technology were very poor. He basically delegated all of this stuff out. This is the only moment in which he's involved in a core question about the atomic bomb, Kyoto versus Hiroshima. And I think that he may have misunderstood what the question was. We'll come back to that in a second. The result of this is Kyoto gets officially removed from the target list. It's gone. And again, Yokohama had already been removed because it had been firebombed months before. So the final strike order is prepared. This was drafted by Groves. This is the draft of it. the 509th Composite Group, the first special bomb as soon as the weather is delivered, blah, 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 about August 3rd on one of the targets. And originally, as you can see, it said in the priority listed, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Niigata. They felt they needed an extra target on there. They wanted a backup for every single possible raid, so that if the first target was obscured by clouds or something, that it wouldn't be, you could go to the secondary target. When you take Kyoto off the list, it makes Niigata a bit too far away. There's only limited fuel on these aircrafts. Niigata isn't sort of north in Japan, whereas both Kokura and Hiroshima are in the south. They go to the Army Air Force planning people, and they say, we need another city that's near Hiroshima and Kokura. And they say, okay, Nagasaki. And it gets written on there literally by hand, and Nagasaki in the lowest priority as a backup thing. This is how Nagasaki gets on the list, which I just always like to point out, because often in our narratives on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we emphasize Nagasaki as being this important target, and it was also chosen with great deliberance. And you can see that it was really added at the last possible second. This is the day before this order gets finalized. You might notice also clause 2 on there while we're talking about it. Additional bombs will be delivered on the above targets as soon as made ready by the project staffs. Further instructions will be issued concerning targets other than those listed above. It's actually a very open-ended order. I'm not sure that Truman understood it was an open-ended order. He was shown this apparently, but I'm not sure he realized that there were going to be 2 bombs ready so quickly. We'll come to that in a second. This draft order was approved by Stimson. He's the sort of final approval necessary to make this into a real order to use the bombs. Okay, so let's imagine that Truman doesn't know that Hiroshima is a city. When would he have definitively learned this? And the answer is on the morning of August 8th. That is when you first see these first aerial photographs. He is given these by Stimson himself in a morning briefing. This is also when they start getting reports from Tokyo describing the damage. These start to enter into American newspapers this morning with extremely large headlines that make it unambiguous that this is a weapon that has destroyed cities, that has killed thousands of people. Sometimes some of these descriptions are extremely vivid. Very large numbers, predicted dead, things like that. And it's not possible, I think, that Truman would have remained ignorant past this point, that not only was this a city, but that women and children were killed in huge numbers. What's interesting about this is we actually see a change in his language on August 8th. This is a draft. I mentioned that Truman was in charge of writing this speech on what had happened at Potsdam. And this picture, by the way, this picture in the background is him writing that speech, supposedly. This is on the USS Augusta coming home. And here's the first draft. The world will note that the first atomic bombs, excuse me, the second draft. The first draft was written before Hiroshima, and so didn't really say anything about the atomic bomb. The second draft is on August 7th. The world will note that the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima, which is purely a military base. Notice that purely again. It's a very distinctive word to put in there. This was because we did not want to destroy the lives of women and children and innocent civilians in this first attack. But it is only a warning of things to come. If Japan does not surrender, bombs will have to be dropped on war industries and thousands of civilian lives will be lost. Again, this is written in Truman's own hand. Do we really, is it possible that in this draft, which he never showed made public, that he's actually reflecting what he believes happened, which is to say Hiroshima is a military base, and that he did not think that lives of women and children and innocent civilians, which is another very peculiar phrase that Truman likes to use. By the time this comes out, specifically on August 8th, there's many drafts of this, the language changes. And here's the sort of final version. The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. Note that they removed the purely. This is still not completely true. Hiroshima is a city with a military base in it, but you can see that they're trying to still emphasize this. This was because we wish in this first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians. Notice that they've weakened these assertions. If Japan does not surrender, the bombs will have to be dropped on war industries, and unfortunately, thousands of civilian lives will be lost. There's a sort of a pathos that's been added to this sort of version of it. Without warning to Truman, the Nagasaki bombing happens. Now, I could spend a whole lecture talking about Nagasaki, but he was not given an alert about this. He was not told ahead of time when Nagasaki was going to happen. It's not clear to me he understood that there was going to be another bomb ready to be used at this point. He did ask for information about the schedule of bombings while at Potsdam, and this is the reply he got. First one of the tested type should be ready at the Pacific base around 6th of August, second one around 24 of August, which he thought was sounded good. The downside is that they had a type of bomb that wasn't tested, which was the one dropped on Hiroshima. They actually had 2 bombs ready around the 6th of August. You wouldn't know that unless you had been paying a lot of attention, and I'm, again, not sure that Truman had been. Nagasaki, as far as I can tell, came as a surprise to Truman. Nagasaki was not the intended target of the second bombing. It was meant to be Kokura. Nagasaki was the secondary target. If Hiroshima is a mistake about what the target was, Nagasaki in some ways is a mistake about control. I don't think that Truman realized that there were going to be 2 bombs within 3 days of each other. And especially given that I don't think he understood how the first bomb was even going to be used. And I just want to point that out because I want you to sort of imagine the mental state of somebody who has perhaps learned that they were deadly wrong about their initial assumption here, and have now, the day after learning this and probably still reconciling this, it happens again. Day after that, Truman gets a letter, read a letter that was sent to the Chief of Staff, George Marshall, by Groves, August 10th, 1945, explaining that the next bomb of the implosion type had been scheduled for delivery on the 24th of August, but they've gained 4 days, and they expect to ship it to New Mexico on the 12th or 13th. Providing there are no unforeseen difficulties in manufacture and transportation to the theater or after arrival in the theater, the bomb should be ready for delivery of the first suitable weather on the 17th or 18th of August. So basically, the day after Nagasaki, Truman now has been informed that they'll have another bomb ready in a week. Notice that this letter is not asking whether they can use it. They already have the order that authorizes them to use it. They can use bombs as soon as they are ready. That's the order that went through. And Truman's response here, unlike the others, is definitive and quick. Immediately, Groves gets a reply back. I'll decipher Marshall's handwriting for you here. It is not to be released over Japan without express authority from the president. At a meeting that morning with the cabinet, Truman tells them that he had given orders to stop atomic bombing. This is from the diary of the Secretary of Commerce, Henry Wallace. He said the thought of wiping out another 100,000 people was too horrible. He didn't like the idea of killing, as he said, all those kids. So this is a potential arc for thinking about Truman's emotional state, right? You have, I think Hiroshima is a good idea because it's a military base, and I've made a decision to attack a military base and spare a city. Then you find out that's wrong, that you actually destroyed a city. Then you find out that the military has more bombs than they really let on, and they're using them without asking you. And then you say, stop, I'm in control now. We are no longer going to be running the show this way. This is my sense of how Truman's mind is evolving on the atomic bomb. It goes from something that he's really not that involved with, thinks he made a decision about that he didn't, and then by the end of it, he's in a really different sensibility about the whole thing. Is it plausible that Truman misunderstood something? I think within the evidence we have, it's completely plausible. It can be made to fit. The question is, when you have evidence that could lead to multiple interpretations, why do you prefer one over the other? Right? Because you could also read all of this if you wanted through a different lens and see it as a different sort of psychological response. What is to be gained? One is, I think this approach explains why the language Truman uses really differs before August 8th and after August 8th. Before August 8th, his vision of the bomb is all positives. 100%. He describes when he hears about the bombing of Hiroshima, again, without learning about casualties or details or anything, he says it's the greatest thing in history. By the end of the year, he's describing the atomic bomb as the most efficient means of mass slaughter of innocent people that has ever been known. That's a really big shift in language. It's a really big shift in attitude. He starts after August 8th talking about the death of innocents, talking about the death of women and children. This is Truman's sort of catchphrase for talking about innocent people. I also think this resolves the mystery of those before and after, those diary fragments much more elegantly than the others, that he actually just misunderstood. To me, that's not implausible, and in fact is a simpler explanation than some complicated thing about him lying to himself. This would all fit in very well with the peripheral role that Truman had on the bombing. He would never say the bombings were unjustified. He always claimed responsibility, arguably more than he needed to. He always took the buck stops here seriously. He always sort of said that ultimately everything that happens as a president is the president's responsibility and their fault, which is, you know, somewhat refreshing these days. But I do think that he actually misunderstood and was more peripheral. The other thing it gets you is that understanding Truman in the post-war. Here's Truman's attitude on atomic bombs, whether the military should be allowed access to them in 1948, because after Hiroshima, after Nagasaki, he no longer authorizes the military to have the bombs. They are held by civilian organizations. Here's a conversation that Truman has that David Lilienthal, head of the Atomic Energy Commission, the civilian organization that was in charge of making bombs, had in 1948. This is in response to the military asking to have access to more weapons. I don't think we ought to use this thing unless we absolutely have to. It is a terrible thing to order the use of something that is so terribly destructive beyond anything we had ever had. You have got to understand this isn't a military weapon. It is used to wipe out women and children and unarmed people and not for military uses. So we've got to treat it differently from rifles, cannons, and ordinary things like that. Again, is this an attitude of somebody who actually feels comfortable with what happened at Hiroshima or Nagasaki? Or is this potentially the attitude of somebody who misunderstood something, feels very bad about that fact, and then also began to distrust the military's own judgment and own sort of forthcomingness on this sort of topic? We can look also at the numbers. Truman, after August 10th, 1945, does not want the military to have weapons. And over the course of his entire presidency, he gives them a tiny amount of nuclear weapons access. He still builds weapons. He's not anti-building nuclear weapons, but he does not trust the military. This is showing you of the bombs they have, how many of them were given to the civilian, kept by the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission, how many were allowed to the Department of Defense. You can see a tiny number, and only this after considerable details have been worked out, were allowed to be put on aircraft carriers near Guam. And Truman, however, even on this point, repeatedly asserts presidential authority here. He is the one who puts into place the idea that presidents are the only ones who can make decisions about nuclear weapons in the United States. And he doesn't do that again before Hiroshima. That happens after Hiroshima. We can compare how different Truman is from his successor, Eisenhower, pretty clearly on this front. Eisenhower did not have these same compunctions and actually did allow the military to have access to nuclear weapons. Now most weapons are in the hands of the military. We don't have time here to talk about Eisenhower and all the complexities there, but I just want to point out how different this is and how really, if you imagined if Eisenhower had been president earlier, the possibility of nuclear weapons becoming more normalized, especially tactical nuclear weapons, are far more likely. Truman has an aversion to nuclear weapons that runs through his presidency after Nagasaki. You don't see it, of course, before Nagasaki, but that's because I think, again, he was confused on these things. But after Nagasaki, he acts like somebody who really doesn't like them. So how should we think about Truman in this standpoint? This is his cover from Time magazine, his Man of the Year cover, and he's knocked off his own cover by the atomic bomb. I always think this is a very strange postmodern sort of image that Time magazine put on its cover in December 1945. I think this is a more expansive vision of the president, and in some ways more damning, right? Being ignorant of something of that magnitude is a damning sort of thing. You should not be in position of responsibility in that sense. On the other hand, it's a little more flattering in some ways because it's not Truman, the guy who destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and then was thrilled about it. It's Truman, the guy who ignorance perhaps led him to inadvertently destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to take part in that, but who then turned around and really changed his approach to these things in interesting ways. So we could say, for example, we would not think of Truman in this slide as the president who decided to use nuclear weapons. That wasn't his role in any of this. He was the president who thought he had chosen to make the first use of nuclear weapons beyond a, quote, purely military target, which, if that had been true, would have been a very different history than the one we have and a very different moral valence to it. He was the president who ordered the use of nuclear weapons stopped the day after Nagasaki. That is, I think, something he doesn't get enough credit for, but he doesn't give an order to use the weapons, but he does give an order to stop using the weapons. For better or worse, he's the president who established a civilian control over nuclear weapons, specifically presidential control. At the moment, that is not extremely reassuring, but this tradition, which has continued on, starts basically on August 10th, 1945. And in the end, he became the president who, perhaps more than any other, ended up establishing the taboo nature of nuclear weapons use. This is ironic, given that he's the only president who presided when they were used on actual cities, but he did a lot of work to make sure that these weapons would not be used again, that they could not be normalized as military weapons and understood as just sort of something the military can make a decision on. So what's the hidden meaning of Hiroshima in the subtitle? That its targeting was perhaps meant as a gesture towards mercy, but ended up through a series of misunderstandings and errors being anything but that. And if that's true, that is a dramatically different understanding of the direction of nuclear history in both positive and negative ways than our traditional story of this would go. All right, thank you so much, and I appreciate you sitting through. And if you'd like to learn more about this, you can look up my paper. I have published on this in a volume called The Age of Hiroshima.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was really amazing and getting us to start rethinking some very common historical conclusions in regard to Truman and his role. I really appreciate being able to hear your original research in this area. And there are a few, so thank you very much. There are a few questions that have come up on the Facebook feed. So let me offer those out first. I have a couple of my own, but I'm gonna wait and see what we have here. So one of the questions comes from a student. In your opinion, with all the research you've done, if the US went through and bombed Kyoto, do you think that it would have been the only target bombed? I know they had a list, but if many military analysts said this was a very big military site, I feel like it could have possibly forced a Japanese surrender. Thanks for a fantastic presentation.
It's a really good question, and I don't know. You know, the one thing that would make it different at Kyoto versus Hiroshima, ironically, is the thing that the Target Committee alluded to, which is that you have many more scientists and intellectuals in Kyoto. And in fact, you have scientists in Kyoto who were part of the very small Japanese nuclear project. These are the same scientists who get sent to Hiroshima to find out what had happened there. Now, if they had been in Kyoto at the time of the bombing, would the Japanese high command have had confirmation much sooner that that the bombing was an atomic bombing? Because this is part of, to me, the question of whether something like Nagasaki happens is, can the Japanese high command actually make a decision based on atomic bombing prior to August 9th? And as it was, one of the reasons they didn't make any decision was because they were spending until the end of August 8th confirming that Hiroshima was an atomic bombing. So to me, that's the one place it would matter. Would it have shocked them into surrender? I have no idea, right? I don't really know if the role of that is very hard to play out. The role of the bombings in general on Japanese surrender are difficult to sort of assess. But I do think it might have changed the timeline in a significant way, in that if you have these university scientists actually saying on August 6th, it's an atomic bomb, it's totally new, that would have changed discussions in Tokyo in a way that they did not change until not only after they got that confirmation, but after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and things like that, which happened on the end of August 8th, August 9th anyway. If that's the case, maybe you avoid Nagasaki, but even then, I think that's very optimistic. I don't know if the military has the free rein to use the bombs as soon as possible, and they can use them within a couple days of each other, it's hard for me to imagine something as momentous as the end of the war happening within that tiny time span there.
Thank you so much. So another question asks us to think about this in a different way, again from a student. Do you think it could have been a misunderstanding of the true size of the bomb rather than a misunderstanding that Hiroshima was a city?
That's a great question. The one thing Truman felt relatively confident on was the true size of the bomb. And that was because he had gotten news of the Trinity test. And this was, as far as I can tell, the only information about the atomic bomb that he definitely retained and understood for his entire life. He would quote from verbatim certain numerical phrases from that report that he got. For example, the first atomic bomb was only used 13.5 pounds of plutonium. And throughout his presidency and even beyond, Truman would love to tell people that all that explosion came from 13.5 pounds of plutonium, which was classified. And the FBI actually was asked to maybe make him stop saying that, and they decided they couldn't do that. But he loved the report of the Trinity test. He read it out loud multiple times. He was very impressed with it. For him, it was sort of a Hail Mary kind of thing. So I think he really did understand that it was a powerful bomb. Now, did he understand how many casualties there would be? Did he understand the extent of the damage? I mean, even the scientists didn't really know that. So that's, it's unreasonable to expect him to know that. The head scientist of the project, Oppenheimer, thought that only 20,000 people would die if you dropped it on a city. So that's a possibility that you could definitely misunderstand that. But I find it more likely, again, that he did not really get that there was going to be so many civilian casualties, in part because I don't think he understood the target that well.
Thank you so much. So a couple of related questions here. Again, from a student, great presentation. One question I have is about the lack of Truman's knowledge on the bomb. Was this because of his own neglect to be involved in this decision making, or because he was not properly informed throughout the whole situation? And then a related question, and a question that is sort of similar to one that I have. Until very recently, with work like yours, the big historical question has always been, was Truman justified in using the bomb? Does your work suggest that we should really be focusing a lot more on Leslie Groves? What were his motivations? Did he believe he was just following orders, or did he have a strong feeling about when, whether, how to use the bomb? And if I may, because I know we're giving you a lot here, in addition to Leslie Groves, I'm wondering if we should be thinking about those in the interim committee and those who are trying to construct the post-war architecture in terms of who's really holding the knowledge here and who's controlling the knowledge.
I'm going to answer the second part first, then we'll come back to the first part. But yeah, I think the focus on Truman is the wrong one. And the question of whether he's justified in dropping the bomb is the wrong way to understand the bomb. It's the wrong way to understand the bombings. And I think that there's an interesting history to why the question is always framed that way. It was framed that way by people like Stimson and Truman. Because if you end up going down that line of reasoning, it turns the bombing into a sort of means to an end. And it's a useful instructional, at what point is it okay to do bad things if your goals are good things? And that isn't how anybody framed it at the time. That isn't the historical framing of anybody in that decision. They had a lot of other things on their mind. They had questions about the post-war. They had questions about the long-term architectures and goals. They had questions about Stimson considered the bomb not a weapon, but a new force in the universe, basically. And so this is I think the traditional framing, was he justified, aside from getting the history wrong about who was in charge, I think it actually is one that lends people to almost inextricably accept that there were only two options: use the bomb or invade. That is not what was on the table at the time. That does not reflect it at the time. And it's also not a good model, I think, for morality. I have a lot of problems with the way in which this is talked about, but ends justify the means reasoning. If you have hypothetical things you're avoiding, hypothetical unknown numbers of deaths, and with the invasion of Japan, you can come up with a lot of those. You can justify almost anything as being a moral act in that sense. And to me, that's actually a very poor way to think about morality. And I actually would credit some of this way of thinking with many of the American misadventures in the Cold War, which is it's okay to support a dictator if he's our dictator and this kind of thing. I actually think that that type of framing in which the bomb is often used still today for that is the wrong way. Remind me briefly what the first question was. My brain got focused on that. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. It's about Truman being misinformed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And why and how? Was it his fault, or was it the fault of those around him?
I mean, both, right? I mean, at some level, ultimately, it must be both. But Truman was in over his head. He did not expect to be president. Roosevelt had never told him anything about the bomb at all. He learned about the bomb the day Roosevelt died. He was suddenly literally picked out of a room in which he was drinking with his Senate buddies and said, now you're the president, good luck. And he was never close to any of the planning that Roosevelt had been doing. He had never done foreign policy or war planning or anything like that. He was a good domestic politician, but that isn't the same thing as being the president. And so he was vastly unprepared. And it's not just me saying this. He would say this. He would tell you this. Everyone around him would say this. People would say he just tries to like manage what he's doing. He gets a little better as the presidency goes on, but he's swimming in things. Now, should his advisors have made more clear? I think so, right? Like that's a pretty low bar to expect that on these kinds of things that they think are important. That being said, I think there's sort of a perfect storm of Truman being over his head, Truman being kind of intellectually disinterested in some of these things. He's just not interested in science and technology ever in his presidency. And combining with his advisors, basically trying to sort of maneuver for power around him, I think that creates a circumstance in which him being confused is highly possible.
Great, thank you. And Arjun Makijani asks, and going back to Leslie Groves, which Alyssa Faison also referred to, should we be focusing more on Leslie Groves? What were his motivations? And Arjun Makijani comments that Groves was not a field commander in the war, so how did he have the tactical authority on the bomb rather than, say, MacArthur?
I think Groves gets a lot less attention than he ought to. He's much more important to the story than most people know. He's not just the guy building things. He's running his own intelligence organization, his own military organization, his own foreign intelligence organization. He creates an entire industry from scratch, basically overnight. And he does it with a level of secrecy that was unprecedented at that time. And this is partially the answer to Arjun's question. How does he have the tactical authority to do this? Because he is the only one who is sort of in the position to know what's going on with most of this. And he very jealously keeps that. And he sets it up with Simpson's accord so that basically the role is Groves is actually the one making these calls, even though he's using tactical field commanders. So it's LeMay is technically in charge of the bombings going on, but he's getting the instructions from Groves. That that use order I showed you is technically from Handy to Spatz. But Groves is writing it, right? This is all Groves's machinations. He's very good at wielding that kind of, you might call secret power. And amusingly, I mean, maybe it's not amusingly, but the minute he is no longer doing that, he totally fails. I mean, he's basically, within 5 years after the end of the war, he's forced to retire because he can't get along with other people. He's only functional in that role. But in that role, he's immensely functional.
Thank you. So we are just at the end. I wanted to just mention, someone asked us if you could point us to the paper that you've written on this subject. So if you want to, sort of put that in the chat here on Zoom, I'll put it out on the Facebook feed. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to my students over the last couple of days who are currently taking a course about the history of the atomic bombings with me. And they've just been doing a tremendous job in commenting and asking questions. So I want you to know that I see you out there and I really appreciate you. Alex, thank you so much. I feel like I would like to be here and hear more of this and have this conversation for much longer. I hope you'll join us again sometime. And thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be here, and feel free if students want to email me, I'll try to email back, but definitely take a look at the paper. And the other thing I would just say to students, this is one of those areas of history where it seems like people have gone over it 10 million times. When will you ever find something new to say? But there's so much there. It's so rich. Don't ever be discouraged by that fact. There's a lot there, and it always needs fresh eyes.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.